Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
In a very fundamental way, solutions are tossed up, alternatives are tossed up by machine intelligence, and the choice will be very difficult to make. One is purely logical, the other is emotional, or more justice-oriented. There will be more conflict of correctness against justice. The conflict I visualize is the concept of correctness, logical correctness, and a sense of justice. Issues of this kind will toss up, and there human intervention becomes more intense.
Welcome to None Wiser Than the Law, a series of conversations with Justice MN Venkatachaliah, covering the law, his life, politics, and the Constitution. The title of this podcast comes from Aristotle, who said, "To seek to be wiser than the law is the very thing which is by good laws forbidden." The role of a judge is therefore not to presume wisdom, but to unearth the wisdom of the law. Justice Venkatachaliah quotes this aphorism in a judgment, and in this series, we explore his judicial philosophy that shaped India's jurisprudence. My name is Alok Prasanna Kumar, and I'm a co-founder of the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. I had a chance to speak to former Chief Justice of India, MN Venkatachaliah, in August 2023. In our conversation, we covered a range of topics, from his beginnings as a lawyer to his tenure as a Supreme Court judge, his landmark judgments, and his views on developments in law and society. In the final episode of the series, we will be speaking to Justice Venkatachaliah on a range of issues related to the Indian Constitution, the evolution of its basic principles, and the challenges that lie ahead for India in the coming years.
People like you must sit in group and discuss these things and evolve something, try it, count it as a coin. It gives a healthy ring, take it, otherwise throw it away. A lot of trial and error is necessary. The whole thing today, the expectation is whatever you try must be correct. It will never so. At the end of the day, you may find it a useless thing, but it is worth experimenting.
That's a very valid point, and I think that sort of gives us the encouragement to try a lot of. I think there is a lot of scope for such innovation in the legal profession and the judiciary. I want to take our conversation a little bit in a slightly different direction, which is the state of federalism in India. And I think you have seen the evolution of the understanding of federalism in India. And you mentioned Tamil Nadu and the NEET controversy over there, and that is also seen as a center state issue. This is something you addressed also in the NCWRC, the state of federalism and so on. How do you see generally the center-state relations in India at the moment? Do you see that it is conflicting, it is something...
The whole problem is this. To see is as a conflict between center and state is to think that we have a pure federalism. It's a wrong notion. It is a centralized system working through a quasi-federal structure. For example, the judiciary is an integrated judiciary. Whenever the judges are asked to go from one high court to another, it is emphasizing the integral quality of the judicial system. That is a negation of the federal concept. And too much of emphasis on federal aspect takes away the energy of the nation. And too much of a restriction on emphasis on the centralized concept of the notion of Indian state again depresses the regional genius. So some kind of a healthy compromise is necessary. For example, you remember when one of the chief ministers of Tamil Nadu, he made a beautiful speech in the parliament. Pandit Nehru was so impressed by his...
Might have been Mr. Annadurai.
Annadurai, right. He told in parliament, why have you chosen the peacock as the national bird? You must have had crow as the national bird if you are democratically inclined. And he wanted this Tamil Nadu to secede. He was entertaining separate statehood for Tamil-speaking people. Then I think Pandit Nehru in the National Integration Council invited Sir C.P. Ramaswamy to head a committee. And the first interim report of that committee was that every person who contests election from local body village panchayat to the parliament must subscribe to an affidavit that he believes in endorses the integrity of the Indian state. That was the subject matter of the 42nd Amendment, perhaps. After that, another amended his own party constitution to incorporate that thing there. And that pulled down the force of that movement of secession. Secondly, when Tamil Nadu again was thinking of that, Rajagopalachari brought in the anti-Hindi movement as a counter to distract the attention of people into something else. So these are things that we must understand the significance of these things. And to think of India as a pure federation is the starting point of so many misgivings. I think West Bengal coal-bearing lands, case 1966, B.P. Sinha's judgment is a very wrong judgment. Coal-bearing lands, I think 66.
The reason why I also ask is that we have seen that it has evolved over the years. We have seen Articles 371, capital A to J, which deal with specific states, and you've authored the majority judgment in R.C. Paudyal versus Union of India in the context of Sikkim. The relationship between the Indian Union and every state is not exactly the same. Sikkim, for instance, got certain special privileges like Nagaland has, and till recently Jammu and Kashmir did. How do you sort of see these special provisions? Where do you see them fitting into the larger scheme of federalism?
It is these exceptions that strengthen the rule. An exception has two things. It departs from the rule, but it strengthens the rule. And these are things in a growing demographic and democratic movement. These are some of the things which you must face directly and accept them as a part of the solution. And if two truths appear contradictory, you can't reject one and accept another. You must accept them as a part of the mystery of things. You must accept both as a part of the mystery of things. Political systems are always a mystery. You know, they are products of evolution. They have not come overnight. They have formed themselves over centuries.
Which brings me to another aspect of this evolution, which is something like the GST Council as it exists today.
Extraordinary thing of integration of a purely federal division. My goodness, you see, people are not sufficiently excited about the fundamental ideas that made it possible, the fundamental concepts that made it possible. Whether it is a successful thing or not, the philosophy behind it, the advancement of a national purpose, or something which people don't have the freshness of emotion to thrill at. That's the capacity of Indian politicians to do these things. Those bureaucrats who have supported this need our great commendation. That they thought such a thing was possible in India.
And the reason why I bring up the GST Council is because it's a great example of the evolution of the idea. Because it started with the VAT system also, the value-added tax system, which brought all the states and the union together without a formal legal structure.
This itself, evolution of GST itself, could be a subject matter of an education in the political culture of the country. People don't understand. They don't understand the message of that. The working of it is one thing. It's a work for queerly satisfactory. We have 1,60,000 crores every month.
What does it tell you? I mean, let's talk about it a little bit. What does it tell you about our political culture that we have the GST Council?
Federal concept is a flexible concept. It's not a pure ironclad system. And it can work beautifully in the hands of good men, in the hands of even ordinary politicians. Though there was initial hiccups, how the entire country rallied behind it, and the GST Council itself is an example of cooperative federalism.
That's actually very interesting. And at least we've had, I think, 50 odd meetings of the GST Council. And as far as I know, only about 2 or 3 issues have actually been put to a vote. Everything else has been decided by consensus.
This is something which in the warring sections of when you see things are irreconcilable in many areas, is a lesson in the reconcilability of great issues in the country.
No, and that's quite right. But there are other also irreconcilable, one of which is water sharing, which I think Karnataka is one of those states which has multiple such issues. Do you think, and this is where I come from, is the judicial approach the best way to this? Don't you think?
No. No. Judicial approach is the last resort. And it can be resolved the way in which GST has been ultimately resolved. It is genius to the people and their sense of patriotism. Ultimately, there's underlying commitment to the unity of the country. This demonstrates, in a non-trivial sense, our capacity for, as somebody said, our capacity, our inclination toward justice makes democracy possible. Our inclination to injustice makes it necessary. This is exactly translated into this thing. People have not sung sufficient praise of this effort. I remember Chidambaram talking about it in his days. How the idea, those who generated this idea that this is the better of mankind.
No, that's right. And I think the GST Council itself was an idea which was in the works for about 6 to 7 years across two governments before it was finally shaped. And there are a couple of things about it which still can be improved, in my opinion. But as a larger political
It must be seen as a work in progress, not the ultimate thing. The compulsions, the international compulsions of the World Trade Organization, how much of domestic adjustments are necessary is an ongoing process. This is where law and economics can play a wonderful role. And people trained in this science, how they can more refine it, plug loopholes. And even today, at least 40% of the revenue is lost under the table.
No, that's true. But again, to come back to the example of where this cooperation seems to break down, we have seen that the same ideas and the principles and the feelings.
This is where the judiciary comes in. This is the creative role of the Indian courts, Indian judicial system. Whenever something comes to a breaking point, there can be a panacea for a cure. For example, in the Canadian Constitution, if a law is challenged, the court doesn't take it down if they think that it's unconstitutional. They have a conference with the legislature and the executive. They say, this is our, we want to take it down. You have an alternative thing and make a law necessary. And before they bring a new law in it's a conference. I referred to it in one of the 90s after I retired. I think Thakur invited me to deliver the Constitutional Day address in 2016 or somebody, some 7 years ago. I spoke about this.
No, that's a very valid point but also what I get the sense is that the proceedings become adversarial. It is seen as a win for either this state or that state.
Kind of see that even a challenge to a constitutional provision is not adversarial there in Canada.
I'm talking about in India.
It is in India.
In India, because I follow court proceedings somewhat closely, and I see the people's reactions to it. And it's seen as if we get this kind of order, it's a win for us, as in people of Karnataka or for people of...
The example is Kaveri.
Yes, especially in the context of...
You seem to own God's water yourself.
How do you think the judiciary should approach these questions, which is where I really wanted to bring the conversation to? Of course, the judiciary is the last resort. Of course, you want it to be as...
You must first doubt the idea of a kind of adversarial atmosphere, adversarial attribute to this thing between the state and the union government. You can't call it central government. That's a wrong expression. That gives some area of superiority to this thing. It's a cooperative effort. And then they must understand it's not you are debating it as an idea. And it's all part of India. Therefore, the court has that role of dousing this extreme, for example, Kaveri dispute. It was taken as a dispute between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. No. Kaveri is not Karnataka's product or Tamil Nadu's product. It's God's gift. And that judgment put to a great controversy. I must say that Deepak Mishra wrote a very good, sensible order.
No, that's quite right, because we have seen, I suppose, that in the last few years, despite the level of rains or otherwise, major controversy hasn't happened about the usage of the waters of the Kaveri. So perhaps that might be the right way forward. But I also want to sort of bring the topic to another thing, which is currently in the news, because even as we speak, the matter of the repeal of the sort of repeal of Article 370 and the loss of Jammu and Kashmir statehood is being debated in the courts. And I thought I could ask you, what was your view on Article 370? Did you think it was necessary to be in the Constitution or something that could have been done away with? And the way in which it was done away with?
The matter is under debate in the court. Let us reserve our comment for a later date. After they just take their view. And very interesting arguments are being advanced. It became the Quebec secession case, the beautiful judgment of the Canadian Supreme Court. In fact, it happened in Australia earlier. Very interesting cases came up. Let us see what happens.
But more in terms of what it says about India's federalism, do you see that as something which might harm the larger compact which underlies our constitution?
At least 1,000 years of history is condensed in this kind of controversy. To oversimplify it is as bad as overcomplicating it. It has to be solved through the wisdom of the current generation. You can't have the power of prejudice of the past or too many illusions of the future. You have to have a good, healthy compromise on some of the issues. That becomes the norm.
No, that's right. And I think, of course, maybe whenever the Supreme Court delivers its judgment, it will have an important bearing on not just Jammu and Kashmir, but also on federalism.
In a sense that Hojal case also raised that issue. In fact, Verma dissented. I think Sharma also dissented. That's saved by one vote. 3-2 was the judgment.
And it involved, I suppose, also a very tricky case about one of the very few instances of a state coming into the Indian Union, the other, of course, being Goa. On what terms a state will enter the Union? Can the Union agree to it? And there is always that.
This drama is being reenacted in a different context in the European Union. It was not originally a part of the Indian state. Later it came in. And you apply the standards of the past to exclude something, it will be unrealistic politically.
Do you see the EU also as an interesting experiment in federalism? Or do you see that more in the context of an international?
It's more an international issue. Local federal standards of federalism to be applied to an international issue will be a politically unwise thing for a state to do for itself.
Because I think the move is also in that context to take more power and centralize in some way. And that is also, I suppose, leading to some friction.
Right.
And the constant debate there is who should we let into the union and who we shouldn't.
They are political realities. You can't wish them away.
It's about how you navigate around those political.
Right.
The 80s and the early 90s in India, I think some people describe the 80s as perhaps one of the most difficult decades for the Indian Union. And perhaps one of the reasons why it was also because of the large level of internal communal strife. We see a lot of instances eventually ending in the Ram Janmabhoomi and the destruction of the Babri Masjid. And I suppose relatively it's been better the last 2-3 decades. But do you see those tensions arising once again?
No. I think communities are growing up in a hurry. They know what is good for them and not what is so good for them. And I think people are wiser today than they were some 50 years ago. I think enlightened self-interest of a group itself will give them guidance of proper decision. I think it may have democratic implications, not demographic implications.
You mean democratic implications?
Yes.
Because the reason why I also
it was a demographic issue. It has become a democratic issue. And that transformation itself is a civilized transformation.
I would love to hear your thought. How do you say that it has, from a demographic issue, become a democratic issue?
It is now being evaluated in terms of constitutional values, more than religious. At one point in time, it's a political power. Today, it's a constitutional debate. It has now been elevated into a higher level of debate. It was lesser of a muscle debate. Now it is an intellectual debate.
And how was it? Because, again, a lot of the listeners will not have full context on how communal violence played out in the 70s and perhaps the 80s. What made you say that it was more of like a muscle power or a demographic kind of?
Communities were taught that is the instrument of contact. That's the British legacy, keeping the two communities apart. Though fundamentally there's no real ground as Indians, we are one. We have nowhere else to go. You can't jump off the planet. And that everyone would realize someday or the other. It's only narrow political and personal interests that kept people, liberal education has opened up their minds. Everybody asked the question, why should we do that? Earlier they would do that without asking that question. Today I hope and believe that education and the atmosphere the world over has opened their minds to ask a question. That's the beginning of a reform.
And you now say that the debate or the issues have been elevated, right? They've become more constitutional. Like what examples would you give in that way?
For example, the Ram Janmabhoomi dispute was accepted through a court judgment. Some 30 years ago, it wouldn't have been acceptable to a particular community, either this community or that community. That itself is an indication that people want a legal solution, not a political solution. This is the progress of any country. This is the evolution. India is not static. No country is static. What we were 50 years ago in the 80s, we are not the same thing today in our attitudes, in our habits, in our beliefs, in our interaction with fellow men.
And do you see how the political class responds to this? Has that changed in some way, or do you see that?
It is political response is a limited response. National response is different from a national consensus is different. If you ask anybody, any citizen of this country, any inhabitant of this land, what do you think of it? Thank God this has been solved. Articulation may not be adequate to convey the sentiment, but it gives an indication of state of mind. Thank God this thing is over.
On that note, do you sort of see the fact that there are now at least two other major disputes working their way through the courts? Do you see that as perhaps not as bad as, say, what led to the Ram Janmabhoomi issue? Or do you still see that as worrying signs that the whole cycle may be repeated? Because I'm talking about Varanasi.
Anything that creates friction between two communities is worrying. But having regard to the way in which we went through a painful process in Ram Janmabhoomi, my prayerful wish is the same thing should not repeat. Someday, somewhen, somehow, some kind of sense will dawn on everybody concerned and accept the intermediation of a court. And this is a safety valve. Though we say it's over-activism or under-activism, I think so that it's a safety valve. You must understand it in political terms.
No, that's very right. And I suppose that is perhaps how we have to evaluate and understand some of these.
The one case that ended up as an impeachment in Parliament, Mr. Ramaswamy's.
Yes.
See, it's a political process. It's not a legal process. It's a political process. There's a legal component and a political component. This is for the safety of the Indian judiciary. The highest point that establishes two things. This can be anything, but there is a political process that protects the judges.
Do you think that political process also has a responsibility to the citizens to ensure that we will take action against judges who has done wrong?
See, the process itself is the panacea. The result is episodic. Whether one judge was removed or he continued is not this thing. But there is a process in position. That's the message. With the political process, you must accept the political response and behavior. And you can't sit in judgment over it. Then it says Parliament is right when you think it is right. It is not so.
But it also brings the question into account, like, how do we hold judges accountable? I mean, do we sort of accept that this is the limitation of the political process, that sometimes even if it is proved to be wrong, they may not face a consequence? Or do we sort of find another way to hold them accountable?
They said, guilty is a sure cure for headache or dandruff. So we have tried so many things. And there's this system in position. That's exactly what we need, a system, not the outcome in a particular case. You may partially test the tensile strength of the system. You can change the system. But as long as the system is there, you can't question the outcome of it.
No, that's fair enough. And there's also the question of post-tenure appointments of judges. And we have seen that, a lot of them are mandated by law, where retired Supreme Court judges, retired High Court judges are required to serve on tribunals and on various commissions. But there is a worrying trend, and this is a trend which a study has shown, that judges tend to become more pro-government as their tenure comes to an end, with the hope of getting a post-retirement position. I wanted your take on that. Do you think that we should do away with these?
There can't be a generalization. For example, after retirement, I was asked to accept vice presidentship. The Prime Minister sent a letter to one of his ministers, who was a former judge of the Calcutta High Court, D.B. Paul. He came to my house. He didn't know where I stayed. So there was one lawyer of the Income Tax Department, one gentleman here is still practicing. Devi Pal, after he quit his office as judge of the High Court, was practicing on the tax side. So this tax lawyer knew him. Both of them came and he got me a letter asking my consent to be considered for this thing. I said, the moment I sign this letter, I'll bring the edifice of the Supreme Court several notches down. He spoke of Hidayatullah. I said Hidayatullah was a great man. They were a great political family. I think his brother became a minister in Pakistan, Ikramullah. I think in the present context it's not so. But I can't say that, for example, great lawyers became governors general, viceroys in India. Good lawyer has great potential for a service. So you can't make any generalizations about it. But as long as it is not a temptation to swerve from this thing, it all depends on the persons. Many people have conducted themselves very well.
And we do have examples of tribunals which have been run very well with great credit post-retirement as well. But my larger question, of course, is should we just assume that only judges should be suitable for these roles? Should the government be looking for others also?
The government should be looking for all others, including judges. Whoever fits the bill must be picked up, and not as some kind of reward for past favors.
Because one thing that is somewhat sarcastically also said is that the lure of the type 8 bungalow in Lachan's Delhi is quite lucrative for a lot of people. I hope that is not the case, but in a sense, the impression that the public tends to get is that this is a person who the government likes.
See, by going there, they lose a lot of money in arbitrations and other things. Those who accept that give up other things. There can't be a generalization. It's all a matter of... In fact, I remember when the industry was nationalized in England, the Labour Minister said, they was asked, why has he not appointed the top man? He said, I'm trying to persuade a Tory to accept it. And till I succeed, I'll persist in it. The Labour Party wanted a Tory to chair that corporation. I think Steel or Coal Corporation was nationalized by the Labour government.
And I suppose that sense of bipartisanship or that sense of consensus-based politics, let's call it that. Do you see that still strong in, we've spoken about one great example, which is the GST Council. But do you see that breaking down in some ways, at least in the way in which our parliament is functioning?
See, India has shown great resilience against this tendency. Parallelly, two systems are running. One is the weaker, the stronger. And in all cases, in the long run, the stronger has prevailed. Hope to be optimistic. The pessimism is around the area of electoral practices, the way in which we toss up our representatives. That process requires perhaps a stronger relook than anything else. That's the foundation of everything else. There are two views about it. Whether a court can say this must be the composition. It is a political function. When the court says to say no to it is another problem. Two wrongs can't make one right. In regard to various electoral interventions made by associated democratic reforms for the accountability of these things, Supreme Court did that, rooted it in some constitutional provision. They rooted it in some constitutional mandate. Here, it is wise to do it in the domain of both the executive and the judiciary, and wisdom is not the monopoly of the judiciary.
So if we are to look for a third purpose, seen as an independent person, so you have the Prime Minister, you have the leader of the opposition, who would that third person, where would that person come from, where the public could see that the deck is not stacked in favor of the ruling party?
Why don't you root it and say it's not a recommendation? You say this is rooted in this fundamental right in the document of the constitutional document, and therefore this is mandatory. Is it advisable to do that is a matter of different. You should a mandate. You should a mandamus to say that you must do that. Then they disobey, they will be punishable.
That's possibly also where my disagreement with this judgment is, which is that it's not as if we haven't had free and fair elections because of this system of appointment. Did the court really need to get into it? Did the court really need to say, look into the appointment process for the election commissioner? Maybe there have been, like you said, some perhaps less than best people for the job, but perhaps the process itself wasn't a problem.
You're right. I agree with you. You see, there is a limit to judicial power. And this is a recommendation, you take the risk of being dishonored, disrespected. You sent a mandamus, then there's a different cup of tea. Then it's only review of the judgment that could have said till then it's the binding on government.
But for example, in the recent Enforcement Directorate extension, twice the government does not listen to the Supreme Court. What do you do in a case like this?
But you must accept what the court said about the right or wrong of things. And that's the lesson. What happened in an individual case is not the thing. There's the indictment of the court is the real thing. They could reverse the matter.
You have talked about the kinds of civilizational challenges that India and its government and its systems face. How do you see technology impacting the way the judiciary functions going forward?
In a very fundamental way. Solutions are tossed up, alternatives are tossed up by machine intelligence, and the choice will be very difficult to make. One is purely logical, the other is emotional, or more justice-oriented. There will be more conflict of correctness against justice. The conflict I visualize is the concept of correctness, logical correctness, and a sense of justice. Issues of this kind will toss up, and there human intervention becomes more intense.
And because the reason why I also ask is, I got the sense, and when I was in practice, and I still continue to speak to a lot of people who are thinking of the legal route, people don't necessarily go to court to get a favorable order, they go to be heard. And I wonder if the technological process allows for that.
Technological process will always allow that, but it limits the intervention of the court. It's a limitation of the argument. You see, logic is always a friend of justice, but it can go against the sense of justice as humans understand it. Human concept of justice is partially emotional. A machine is purely logical. So ultimately, tremendous civilizational changes will occur. The other day, he was telling me that some gentleman in America was interacting with the artificial intelligence, and overnight he spent, and then it came up with you said you would arrange a lecture of this person in the Bangalore International Center.
Yeah, and basically it was the New York Times correspondent, and by 4 a.m, the AI was telling him that he loves AI more and he should leave his wife and join the AI.
You wanted to invite him to deliver a talk in the Bangalore International Center.
Yeah, but he's in USA, so there's a bit of a challenge.
You can be online.
I know.
You can be online. You see, this is something which lawyers must be more worried about than anybody else. The burning enthusiasm and vigorous vitality of thinking. Everybody seems to be tired. Nobody is excited about it.
About the use of technology, about AI.
Let us wait and see the policy. Let us see what happens. But suddenly, I always caution them, twilight becomes darkness suddenly, without your noticing. Then what will you do?
What do you see are the kinds of challenges that Indian society as such will face from this technology? What do you think the challenges we'll have to be prepared for?
What the future poses is the test of your intellectual and moral integrity. Everybody will be assessed in terms of his moral and intellectual integrity. And those who are not up to the basic level of personal and moral integrity will be tossed out. Society will see them exposed.
With that, we conclude None Wiser Than the Law, our 7-episode podcast series with Justice MN Venkatachaliah. This episode was recorded at the Indian Institute of World Culture in Bengaluru, and I'd like to thank the team and staff at IIWC for making this possible. I'd also like to thank my colleague at Vidhi Bengaluru, Pratiksha Ulal, for her research help during this podcast.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.